Mark had always dreamed of having a flexible job that would allow him to earn extra income while balancing his responsibilities. When he stumbled upon a relatively new car model being sold at an incredibly low price, he couldn't resist the opportunity. Little did he know, this purchase would lead him into a whirlwind of supernatural events that would change his life forever. In the beginning, everything seemed perfectly normal. Mark was thrilled with his sleek new vehicle, using it for part-time driving gigs around the city. The car was in great condition, and he quickly became accustomed to its features. For the first few days, there were no signs of anything unusual, just the everyday hum of a working man navigating through his routine. However, a few days into his new job, strange occurrences began to disrupt his otherwise mundane life. It started with glitches in the radio. At first, it was minor static during his favorite songs, but soon it escalated to sudden changes in volume and random stations flickering on and off. This odd behavior was quickly followed by the air conditioning inexplicably turning icy cold, even on chilly days. Mark would adjust the temperature only for it to revert to a chilling setting moments later. These peculiarities nagged at him, but he dismissed them as quirks of a second-hand vehicle. As time went on, Mark began to experience disconcerting lapses in concentration. He would find himself driving with a blank mind, as if the world outside had faded away. Strangely, he often found himself pulled to a specific spot in the city, a quiet park where he would park and stare blankly at the trees and the sky. This behavior puzzled him, and he started to wonder if the car had some sort of strange influence over him. As the days went by, these occurrences became more frequent, leaving him increasingly bewildered and concerned about the unsettling grip the car seemed to have on his mind. One fateful day, while parked at his usual spot, Mark felt an unusual chill in the air, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted, and an eerie silence enveloped him. As he sat in the car, lost in thought, a ghostly figure materialized in the passenger seat. Mark's heart raced as he turned to see a young man, translucent and shimmering with an ethereal glow. His features were soft, yet his expression bore a weight of sorrow that struck Mark deeply. The ghost looked around as if he were still trying to grasp his surroundings, then fixed his gaze on Mark. "I am Alex," he said, his voice echoing softly, like a whisper carried by the wind. "I was a victim of a hit-and-run incident caused by the previous owner of this car." As the words sank in, the realization hit Mark like a freight train. He was driving the vehicle linked to a tragic event, and he could feel the weight of Alex's unresolved fate pressing down on him. The sadness in Alex's eyes mirrored the tragedy of his untimely death, a story yearning to be told. Mark could see fragments of memories flickering in Alex's gaze, a flash of laughter, a glimpse of a life interrupted. The air around them seemed to thrum with the energy of what had once been. Overwhelmed, Mark struggled to comprehend the reality of the situation. The ghost's presence felt both otherworldly and intimate, as if they were bound by a shared purpose. "Please," Alex continued, his voice tinged with urgency. "I need your help to find the man who did this to me. I can't rest until he is brought to justice." At first, Mark was hesitant, wrestling with fear and disbelief. The idea of working with a ghost was daunting, and he felt overwhelmed by the weight of the task ahead. "Why me?" he thought, doubting his ability to help. However, as he looked into Alex's sorrowful eyes and listened to the urgency in his voice, Mark began to understand the gravity of the situation. He realized that Alex was trapped in a cycle of unrest, unable to find peace until the truth was uncovered. After grappling with his initial reluctance, Mark found a resolve growing within him. He agreed to help, motivated not only by empathy but also by the realization that he couldn't ignore Alex's plight. They embarked on a quest to track down the previous owner, a man named Jack, who had fled the scene of the accident. As they dug deeper, piecing together clues and talking to witnesses, Mark felt a mix of fear and purpose. The weight of the investigation pressed down on him, yet he was driven by a newfound sense of responsibility. The bond between the living and the dead strengthened as they worked together, united by a shared goal of justice. Mark felt a connection to Alex that transcended the boundaries of life and death, a partnership born from the desire to right a wrong that had haunted them both. After an intense investigation, Mark and Alex meticulously pieced together a timeline of events leading to the fateful night of the accident. They retraced Alex's last moments, speaking with witnesses who had been near the scene. Each conversation revealed fragments of information, some recalling a dark sedan speeding away, others mentioning a man with a distinctive tattoo. With every clue, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, and Mark's determination grew stronger. Days turned into weeks as they scoured the city, visiting bars, diners, and local hangouts, where they hoped to find someone who might recognize Jack. They followed leads that sometimes felt like wild goose chases, but each small breakthrough brought them closer to the truth. Along the way, Mark felt Alex's presence guiding him, the ghost's unwavering spirit bolstering his resolve. Finally, their efforts bore fruit when they discovered that Jack had been spotted in a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. Mark's heart raced as they approached the dilapidated building, its peeling paint and broken windows reflecting the neglect within. Armed with the evidence they had gathered, eyewitness accounts, surveillance footage, and even Alex's own memories, they prepared for the confrontation. With Alex's spirit hovering beside him, Mark knocked on the door. When Jack opened it, confusion flashed across his face, quickly replaced by fear as he recognized the gravity of the situation. Mark stepped forward, determination burning in his eyes. "You can't run from what you've done," he declared, showing Jack the evidence they had collected. As Mark's voice echoed in the cramped hallway, he felt a surge of empowerment. The weight of Alex's tragic story was finally being lifted. Just then, he signaled for the police, who had been waiting nearby. Within moments, they arrived, ready to take Jack into custody. As Jack was led away in handcuffs, a sense of relief washed over Mark. He had faced his fears and fought for justice not just for Alex, but for himself as well. The haunting presence that had once filled him with dread now felt like a comforting weight, reminding him of the journey they had undertaken together. Alex's spirit lingered momentarily, his form glowing with gratitude. "Thank you, Mark," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "You've given me my peace. I can finally rest." With the case finally closed, Alex slowly faded away, leaving Mark with a sense of closure and fulfillment. He had not only helped a lost soul find peace but had also learned the importance of facing the past and taking action against wrongdoing. Mark's second-hand car, once a mere means of transportation, had transformed into a vessel of redemption, forever reminding him of the bond he formed with a ghost who needed a friend, the Whispering Shadows. Ava had always been practical, skeptical of ghost stories and old wives' tales. So when she found the apartment for rent in the old part of town, with its creaky wooden floors and time-worn walls, she brushed aside her friend's warnings with a laugh. The rent was cheap, the space was charming, and she needed somewhere quiet to focus on her freelance work. It was a no-brainer. She moved in on a crisp October evening. The landlord, an elderly woman with sunken eyes and a voice that sounded like the creak of the apartment's old staircase, handed her the keys. Ava barely listened as the woman muttered about the history of the building, mentioning something about its secrets and the rumors. Ava, focused on setting up her workspace, politely nodded and thanked the landlord before shutting the door behind her. The first week went smoothly. Ava enjoyed the solitude and the occasional draft that rolled through her small but cozy apartment. It wasn't until the second week that the strangeness began. It started with faint noises. Ava was used to the normal sounds of an old building, but this was different. A whisper, just beyond hearing, like a distant conversation in an empty room. She assumed it was the neighbors or perhaps a trick of the wind seeping through the cracked window frames. However, as the days passed, the whisper seemed to follow her. At first, it was just at night, a soft murmur near her bedroom door. Later, she heard it in the shower, in the hallway, and even in her living room as she worked late into the evening. Whenever she strained to listen closely, the sound would disappear. One evening, as she was working on her laptop, the soft whisper came again. She paused and slowly turned her head, trying to identify the source. The apartment was silent. Sighing, she went back to her work, dismissing the noise as her overactive imagination. That night, she awoke to a creaking sound, like footsteps moving slowly across the hallway outside her bedroom. Her heart thudded as she listened. The steps paused at her door, and she could almost hear someone breathing. Holding her breath, she peered at the door, half expecting it to open. But nothing happened. After what felt like hours, she heard the footsteps move away, fading down the hall. When she mustered the courage to check the next morning, she found the hallway empty, but her door, which she was sure she had closed, was ajar. Over the following days, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She was becoming increasingly paranoid, losing sleep, and struggling to focus. One evening, exhausted and frustrated, she decided to confront her fears head-on. She turned off all the lights in the apartment and sat in the middle of her living room, waiting, straining to hear the whispers. Hours passed with nothing. She was about to give up when she heard the faint murmur again, a breathy, desperate whisper. It was clearer this time, a single word: help. Ava's breath hitched, and she scrambled for her phone, flicking on its flashlight. She spun around, illuminating the dark corners of the room. Nothing. The whisper was gone. Heart hammering, Ava pulled herself together and, shaking, dialed her landlord. The old woman answered on the third ring, and Ava wasted no time explaining what she had experienced. The landlord was silent for a long moment before sighing deeply. "I didn't think you'd notice," the old woman said softly. "The previous tenants didn't stay long enough." Ava demanded an explanation, her voice trembling. The landlord hesitated before relaying a story that made Ava's blood run cold. Years ago, a woman named Eliza had lived in the apartment. She was a recluse, troubled and deeply lonely. One winter night, Eliza had fallen down the building's steep staircase, dying alone at the foot of the steps. The other tenants often spoke of hearing her footsteps and whispers, but the landlord had dismissed it as hysteria. Until she began hearing them too. "Some say she's searching for someone to help her, to find her," the landlord whispered. "But no one can." Ava ended the call, her hand trembling. She tried to convince herself that it was all an elaborate prank or her mind playing tricks. But she couldn't ignore the whispers anymore, nor the sensation of being watched. That night, Ava decided she'd had enough. She packed her things, determined to leave before morning. As she reached the front door, a chill swept over her, and the soft whisper came again, closer than ever. "Help me." She turned, her flashlight sweeping over the hallway. Her breath caught when she saw her bedroom door slowly creak open. In the doorway stood a faint figure, a woman in a white nightgown, her face obscured by a curtain of dark hair. Ava felt frozen, unable to move, as the figure took a step forward, a pale hand reaching out. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ava dashed through the front door, slamming it behind her. She never returned to the apartment, leaving the key with the landlord and taking only the essentials. Months later, the apartment remained vacant. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was haunted by a restless spirit. Ava didn't care to know. But sometimes, when she was alone in her new place, she could still hear the faint whisper in the dead of night, a soft plea for help, echoing in the dark. "Help me." The writing desk. Lily had a penchant for antiques, always drawn to things that held a sense of mystery and history. So when she stumbled upon an old writing desk at a quaint second-hand shop, she felt an instant pull. Its polished oak surface was marred with faint scratches and the patina of age, but it had a beauty she couldn't resist. The shopkeeper, a wiry, old man with a strange, knowing smile, watched her as she inspected it. "Belonged to an author," he said, his voice low and rough. "A troubled soul, they say." Lily wasn't fazed. She imagined the stories the desk might hold, the late nights, and spilled ink. Without a second thought, she bought it and brought it back to her small apartment, setting it in a corner by the window. As she ran her fingers over its aged surface, she could almost picture herself sitting there, writing deep into the night. It felt perfect. That night, Lily decided to start journaling again, a practice she'd neglected for years. She settled in, pen in hand, and opened her notebook. But the words wouldn't come. She felt a strange heaviness in the air around her, as if the room were waiting. Brushing it off as nerves, she began to write, but each time she paused, she heard faint scratching sounds, like someone scribbling with an old pen. She looked around, but nothing was there. After a few moments, the noise faded, and she dismissed it as her mind playing tricks. The next night, the strange sounds returned, louder this time. She felt uneasy but pushed on, forcing herself to ignore it. Suddenly, she felt a chill, a sharp, unnatural cold radiating from the desk, crawling up her arms. She froze, pen suspended over the page, as the scratching grew louder, echoing in the small room. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Feeling silly, she convinced herself it was just an overactive imagination, a result of too many horror stories. But the following day, as she went to write, she noticed something strange on the desk surface, faint indentations, as if someone had been writing furiously in the dark. Leaning closer, she could make out a single word: why? Disturbed, she ran her hand over the desk to feel the scratches, but as she did, a sudden, sharp pain stung her palm. She pulled her hand back to find a thin, bloody cut, as though an invisible coil had sliced her skin. Heart pounding, she grabbed a cloth and wiped the desk, trying to erase any traces of the scratches. But the feeling of unease only grew. That night, sleep was elusive, and when she did drift off, she dreamed of a figure hunched over the desk, writing feverishly. The figure had no face, just a hollow darkness where its features should have been. When it turned toward her, she woke with a jolt, drenched in cold sweat. The next day, exhausted, Lily decided to investigate. She returned to the shop and questioned the owner, asking if he knew anything more about the desk. The man's smile faded, replaced by a wary look. It belonged to a woman named Clara, a poet, he said quietly. She poured her soul into her writing, but the world never cared. She struggled, lost everything. They say she died at the desk, pen in hand, alone and embittered. He shrugged. Some say her spirit lingers, waiting for her words to be heard. Lily left the shop feeling uneasy, but rather than getting rid of the desk, she felt compelled to write, almost as if Clara's desperation had seeped into her bones. That night, she sat down, pen in hand, and began writing poetry, feeling an urgency she couldn't explain. The words flowed from her like water, and for hours, she wrote feverishly. But each time she paused, she felt the heavy, watchful presence behind her, urging her to continue. After hours, exhausted, she set the pen down. But as she moved to get up, she heard a whisper, a soft, raspy voice near her ear. "Finish it." The voice was pleading, desperate. Lily spun around, but the room was empty. She grabbed her things and stumbled away from the desk, horrified. The feeling of Clara's presence lingered in the room, oppressive and cold, filling every corner. The next morning, Lily resolved to get rid of the desk. She took it to a nearby donation center, leaving it on the curb with a hurried note that read, "Free to a good home." Back in her apartment, the air felt lighter, and for the first time in days, she felt at peace. But later that evening, as she sat down to write, she felt a sudden pang of grief, a strange sense of loss. It was almost as if Clara's presence had attached itself to her, leaving an emptiness in its wake. Over the following weeks, Lily tried to forget, but whenever she picked up her pen, she found herself writing in a style that wasn't her own, melancholy poems, words she didn't recognize. And though she tried to push them away, each night as she wrote, she would catch the faintest echo of a whisper in the room, soft, desperate, and forever seeking an audience. And so, Lily wrote, feeling Clara's presence linger with every word, the faint whisper always behind her, waiting to be heard. The sacred lake. Jack had always loved fishing, especially when he could find an undiscovered spot away from the usual crowds. His work as a traveling salesman often took him to remote towns, and he'd learned to ask locals about secret fishing holes whenever he could. One day, while passing through a small, desolate town, he overheard an old man talking about a lake hidden deep within the nearby forest. Intrigued, Jack approached him and asked for directions. The old man's smile faded, and his eyes grew serious. "That's no ordinary lake, son. We call it the Silent Waters, and for good reason. The people here consider it sacred, a place where spirits linger. Anyone who disrespects the lake doesn't come back the same. Best you leave it alone." But Jack's curiosity was piqued, and the sacred lake only made it sound more intriguing. He brushed off the warning with a polite nod and thanked the old man, determined to find this hidden gem. Armed with his fishing gear and a packed lunch, he made his way through the dense forest, following the winding path described by the old man. The deeper he went, the more he felt a strange tension in the air. Sunlight barely pierced the thick canopy overhead, and the silence was heavy, the kind that seemed to muffle even his own footsteps. After what felt like an eternity, he finally reached the lake. It was eerily still, its surface as smooth as glass. No birds sang, and no insects buzzed around the shoreline. The silence was so absolute that Jack's breathing seemed unnaturally loud. He shrugged it off, reasoning that this peaceful solitude would make for the perfect fishing spot. He set up his fishing rod and cast his line, watching the lure float gently on the water. Hours passed, but he caught nothing, not even a nibble. He'd never seen a lake so lifeless. There were no ripples, no signs of fish below the surface. Frustrated but stubborn, he decided to wait, figuring it was only a matter of time before he'd catch something. As dusk began to settle over the lake, a dense fog rolled in, covering the water in a thick, ghostly mist. Jack shivered, feeling a chill despite the warm autumn air. Suddenly, he noticed movement on the opposite shore, a faint, shadowy figure standing by the water's edge. "Hello?" he called, his voice sounding small and swallowed by the fog. The figure didn't move. It seemed to be staring straight at him, unmoving, its outline barely visible through the mist. A strange feeling crept over Jack, a tingling sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He forced himself to ignore it, convincing himself it was just another fisherman. He adjusted his line and turned his attention back to the water, only to hear a soft splashing sound. He looked up to see the figure stepping into the lake, walking further and further until the water swallowed it entirely. Jack watched, wide-eyed, as the figure disappeared without so much as a ripple. His heart raced, but he tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a strange reflection in the mist. He shook his head and turned back to his fishing. But as the sun dipped below the trees, strange things began to happen. The fog grew thicker, and a low, haunting hum filled the air, vibrating from deep within the water. Jack's line tugged sharply, pulling with a force so strong he nearly fell forward. He tried to reel it in, but whatever was on the other end felt heavy, too heavy to be a fish. His heart pounded as he gripped the rod, the hum growing louder. Then he saw it. Rising out of the lake, pale, ghostly hands emerged, pulling themselves toward the shore. Figures began to appear, their faces blank and expressionless, eyes sunken and hollow, like the lake had drained the life from them. Jack's body froze as they glided closer, their movements slow and deliberate, as if beckoning him to join them. One of the figures stopped inches from him, close enough for him to see the worn, skeletal features and empty eyes. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and a wave of despair washed over Jack so powerful he felt his knees buckle. Panicked, he dropped his fishing rod and stumbled backward, running blindly through the trees. The fog seemed to thicken around him, tendrils wrapping around his legs as he fought to escape. He could hear footsteps behind him, a steady march that grew louder, echoing through the forest. When he finally burst free from the trees, he was gasping for air, his face pale and his clothes soaked with sweat. The old man he'd spoken to earlier was standing at the edge of the forest, a somber expression on his face. "You didn't listen," the man said softly, his eyes filled with a sadness that Jack couldn't understand. "The lake remembers. It takes what it's owed." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed him. The old man reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him back toward town. Jack never returned to the lake, nor did he ever fish again. But the lake remained with him. Every night, he would wake to find his clothes soaked and his hands freezing, as though he'd been wading in ice-cold water. In his dreams, he saw the pale, hollow faces of the lake's spirits, their empty eyes watching him, waiting. And each morning, when he looked in the mirror, his own reflection seemed a little less familiar, his eyes a little emptier, as though the lake was still claiming its price, piece by piece. The haunting of Hollow Hill Tunnel. Evan had been riding his motorcycle for hours, cutting through the chilly autumn air as he made his way home. It was late, and the roads were empty. The only sound was the steady hum of his bike as he leaned into the curves, feeling the thrill of speed against the silence of the night. When his GPS rerouted him through the old Hollow Hill Tunnel, he barely gave it a thought. It was a shortcut, after all, one that would save him nearly an hour. He heard stories about the tunnel, the sort of small-town folklore people like to swap over campfires, tales of strange sounds, shadows that moved on their own, and a crash that had happened decades ago when a truck driver lost control inside. The locals avoided it after dark, saying it was cursed. But Evan wasn't superstitious, and he had no interest in ghost stories. Tonight, he was just a guy in a hurry. The tunnel loomed in the distance, a dark, gaping mouth against the hillside. As he approached, he felt an odd twinge in his stomach. The entrance was like a portal into a deeper darkness, swallowing his headlights beam almost entirely. As he entered, the wall seemed to close in, casting an eerie echo over the hum of his bike. He gritted his teeth and kept his eyes focused ahead. At first, it was just the quiet that unsettled him. The kind of silence that swallowed sound whole, making him hyper-aware of every noise. His bike's engine roared louder in the enclosed space, reverberating off the damp, mossy walls. But soon, the sound shifted, distorting into something almost metallic, like a distant, hollow grinding. He brushed it off as acoustics playing tricks. Halfway through, the headlights flickered, casting everything into pitch black before they sputtered back to life. His pulse quickened. He tried to shake off the unease, reminding himself that he was a grown man, not a kid spooked by shadows. He increased his speed, wanting nothing more than to get out of the tunnel. But as he accelerated, he noticed something chilling in his mirrors, another headlight, faint but distinct, glowing behind him. His heart raced. No one else was on this road, and he hadn't seen a single car for miles. The light grew brighter, closer, keeping pace with him. He glanced back, expecting to see another vehicle, but there was nothing, only the eerie, lone light in the reflection. Evan tried to focus on the road, telling himself he was imagining things, that it was a trick of the tunnel's lighting. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, the feeling of someone, or something, right behind him gnawed at him. The light in his mirrors grew impossibly bright, blinding him even though he knew he was alone. The air inside the tunnel turned icy, and a shiver raced down his spine. It felt as if someone was breathing down his neck, chilling him to the bone. Then, over the roar of his engine, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was soft at first, barely noticeable. But as he rode on, it grew louder, keeping time with the thump of his heartbeat. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Terrified, he chanced a glance in his side mirror. That's when he saw her. A woman's face, pale and lifeless, stared back at him, inches away from his shoulder. Her hollow eyes met his in the mirror, her mouth moving silently, mouthing words he couldn't hear. Her skin was ashen, her hair matted and wet, clinging to her face like she just crawled out of a river. His blood ran cold, his hands clenching the handlebars so hard his knuckles turned white. Panicking, he twisted the throttle, pushing his bike to its limit. The tunnel stretched endlessly before him, as if he'd been swallowed by some endless nightmare. The woman's face remained in the mirror, her expression growing sadder, more desperate. Her lips moved faster, her silent plea haunting him. The tapping grew louder, like fingers drumming against metal, a relentless rhythm that drilled into his mind. His bike's engine strained as he pushed harder, praying he'd see the end of the tunnel soon. He could feel her presence now, right behind him, as if she might reach out and pull him back. Finally, a pinprick of light appeared at the tunnel's end. He focused on it, blocking out everything else, willing himself to escape. The woman's face faded from the mirror, but the tapping didn't stop. It grew more frantic, as if she was trying to hold him back, begging him not to leave. With one final surge, he shot out of the tunnel and into the open night. The tapping ceased, the air warmed, and silence fell around him. He pulled over, breathing hard, his body shaking as he looked back at the tunnel, its entrance shrouded in darkness. He waited, half expecting the tapping to start again or the woman to appear, but nothing happened. Only the quiet of the night and the hum of his idling engine greeted him. Gathering his nerve, he took a final, shaky breath and sped away, vowing never to return. Later, he learned that a woman had died in that tunnel years ago, killed in a crash when her car lost control late one rainy night. Locals said her spirit wandered there, seeking help, forever trying to escape but bound to the tunnel's shadows. From that night on, Evan would catch himself glancing in his mirrors, half expecting to see her pale, haunted face behind him, silently mouthing words he would never understand, a reminder of the terror that lurked on dark, empty roads. The drowning mist. Laura had been looking forward to her vacation for months. After a grueling year, she finally escaped to a small seaside hotel, nestled on a quiet, misty shore. The ocean view from her room was perfect, and the rhythmic sound of waves crashing lulled her to sleep each night. But tonight, restless and unable to sleep, she decided to take a moonlit swim in the sea. It was past midnight, and the beach was deserted, the night air still and filled with an eerie quiet. Leaving her towel on the shore, she waded into the cool water, savoring the sensation as she submerged herself, floating just beyond the gentle break of the waves. The night sky was overcast, shrouding the beach in darkness, with only a faint glow from the hotel lights in the distance. She floated there, gazing up at the cloud-covered stars, feeling the weight of stress dissolve into the sea. But as she drifted, an unsettling feeling crept over her. The air felt strangely heavy, thickening as a faint mist began to roll in from the shore. At first, she thought nothing of it, she'd seen fog drift over the sea before. But this was different, it seemed to move with purpose, spreading across the surface of the water toward her, unnaturally fast. Laura's heart began to pound as the mist closed in, swirling around her with an almost deliberate force. She tried to swim back to shore, but the mist thickened, creating a dense, cold fog around her. It pressed close, filling the air with a damp chill, and as it grew heavier, Laura felt herself struggling to breathe. The mist began to change, shaping itself into the outline of a figure, vaguely human, with long, outstretched arms reaching toward her. The figure's face was featureless, yet there was a sinister energy to it, as though it were pulling her deeper into the cold, silent sea. She tried to scream, but her voice was muffled, swallowed by the dampness. The mist pressed closer, almost clinging to her skin, chilling her to the bone. Her vision blurred as she struggled to pull herself away, but every time she moved, the mist moved with her, tightening, forming a suffocating veil around her. Panic gripped her, and she kicked and thrashed in the water, trying to break free from the misty form. But it was relentless, pressing in closer, its coldness seeping into her skin. She could feel it surrounding her, like icy fingers wrapping around her neck and wrists. Desperate, she turned toward the shore, hoping to see someone, anyone, who could help. But the beach was empty. Then, through the oppressive silence, she heard it, a distant, sharp bark. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of her own ragged breaths. But then it grew louder, closer, breaking through the quiet. Another bark, and another, echoing across the water. She whipped her head toward the shore, squinting through the fog. A dog, a large one, stood on the beach, barking furiously, its body tense and alert. As the barking grew louder, the mist around her began to waver, loosening its grip, as though uncertain. The form hovering over her shifted, flickering, as the barks grew more insistent, piercing through the unnatural quiet. The mist twisted, recoiling from the sound, and for a moment, Lara thought she saw a shadowy face form within it, its mouth open in a silent scream, before it dispersed, melting back into the fog. The dog barked again, louder and sharper, and the mist finally broke, clearing from around her as if swept away by an unseen wind. She gasped for air, coughing as she splashed her way to the shore, her legs shaky and weak. The dog was still barking as she stumbled onto the sand, collapsing near the water's edge. She looked up, and the dog, a scruffy brown mutt, came trotting over to her, his tail wagging as if in greeting. Trembling, she reached out to pat the dog, grateful for its sudden appearance. The dog barked once more, looking toward the sea, where the mist had now fully dissipated, leaving the water clear and calm. Lara looked out, her chest tight with fear, half expecting the mist to return, to reform and drag her back into the cold depths. The dog gave a final bark, as if to assure her it was safe, before trotting back toward the dunes. She watched it disappear into the night, leaving her alone on the beach. Shivering, she wrapped herself in her towel, stumbling back to her room. The memory of the mist clinging to her skin lingered, a reminder of the cold, drowning grip she barely escaped. The next day, as she checked out, she mentioned the dog to the receptionist, describing it as her unexpected savior. "Oh," the receptionist said, her voice dropping. "That dog used to belong to a local fisherman who drowned at sea years ago. After he was lost, people say the dog started wandering the beaches, barking at night as if warning swimmers to stay away. But it's been gone for years now. You must have seen a stray." Lara forced a smile, nodding, but as she left, she couldn't shake the feeling that the dog's bark hadn't just warned her, it had saved her. And as she drove away, she glanced back one last time, grateful to be leaving that mist-covered shore, where something restless waited in the water, drawn back by the quiet lure of midnight swimmers. What was it? Claire and Jake were soaked to the bone. They'd been hiking all day, and what had started as a light drizzle had turned into a full downpour, leaving them drenched under the thick forest canopy. Desperate to find shelter, they stumbled onto a narrow path that led to a clearing, where a large, decaying house sat under a tangle of twisted, leafless trees. The house looked long abandoned, with its windows dark and walls overgrown with ivy. The roof sagged, and the paint peeled off in ghostly strips. But it was the only shelter, and as they approached, lightning flashed, illuminating the eerie structure with stark clarity. Claire felt a shiver, not from the cold but from a deep-seated unease. But Jake only laughed, pulling her by the hand. "It's just an old house," he said, flashing her a grin. "Come on, it'll be fun. Like a horror movie." Claire forced a smile, following him up the creaking wooden steps. The front door hung slightly ajar, and they pushed their way inside, shaking off the rain. The air was stale, carrying the scent of mold and damp wood, and dust floated in faint shafts of light from the open door. They made their way to a room just off the main hallway, where a rickety-looking couch faced a long cold fireplace. "Guess we'll wait out the storm here," Jake said, setting his backpack down. They sat on the couch, listening to the pounding rain, with occasional thunder rumbling in the distance. Claire tried to ignore the growing feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. "Looks like no one's been here in years," she said, glancing around the dim room. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she noticed something odd. Faint scratches ran along the walls, clustered together in places, like claw marks. Jake didn't seem to notice, laughing as he told funny stories to pass the time. his voice echoing in the empty house. Claire tried to laugh along, but she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. After a while, the rain seemed to ease up, and Claire was about to suggest they leave when she heard it, a low, guttural growl from somewhere deep within the house. She froze, her eyes darting to the hallway. Jake's grin faded, and he looked toward the door, his expression tense. "Probably just an animal," he whispered, but there was doubt in his voice. They waited in silence, holding their breaths, but the growl grew louder, followed by a slow, dragging sound, as if something heavy was moving across the floor. Claire's heart pounded as she grabbed Jake's arm, her pulse racing. "Maybe we should go," she whispered, but before they could move, they heard it again, heavy, thudding footsteps that seemed to be coming toward them, echoing through the empty halls. Jake stood, pulling her with him toward the door, but just as they reached it, the footsteps stopped, leaving them in unsettling silence. They exchanged a glance, each too afraid to make a sound, but then came a low rumble, almost like breathing, from just beyond the doorway. And then, emerging from the shadows, two glowing red eyes appeared, piercing through the darkness, fixated on them with an unnatural intensity. Claire's heart stuttered, her body frozen in place as the creature stepped forward, its hulking, massive form becoming visible in the dim light. Its skin was dark and leathery, and it towered over them, its long arms ending in razor-sharp claws that scraped the floor as it moved. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and let out a guttural hiss, its eyes narrowing as it locked onto them. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and Claire felt a wave of nausea as she backed away, clutching Jake's arm. "Run!" Jake shouted, his voice breaking the spell of fear that held her in place. They bolted for the door, sprinting down the hallway as the creature's heavy footsteps thundered after them, echoing through the house. Claire could feel the creature's hot, rancid breath on her neck, and she dared not look back, focusing only on the doorway ahead. They burst through it and down the creaking wooden steps, stumbling onto the muddy ground outside. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still loomed thick and dark. They didn't stop running until they'd reached the edge of the clearing, where they turned back, hoping the creature hadn't followed them. They could barely see the house through the mist and trees, but then a shadow moved past one of the upper windows, and the two red eyes appeared again, watching them. Jake pulled her along, and they kept running, not stopping until they reached the main trail. Out of breath, they glanced back, but the house was hidden by the forest now, swallowed by the darkness. Jake looked shaken, his face pale, but he forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Probably just a trick of the light," he said, his voice unsteady. But Claire knew better. As they hurried away, she couldn't shake the memory of those red eyes, glowing in the darkness, following them with an unnatural hunger. That night, back at their cabin, Claire dreamt of the house. She saw the creature's towering form, its claws scraping the floor, and felt the weight of those red eyes fixed on her, unblinking. The next morning, she told Jake they should leave early, before nightfall. She could still feel that malevolent gaze, as though it were waiting, watching, biding its time until it could draw them back into the shadows. And as they drove away, she glanced at the road winding back into the forest, feeling certain that the creature was still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the next lost soul to take shelter under its haunted roof.